Prima di lasciare la parola a John Barth che ci legge un testo inedito, devo fare auguri e complimenti a Minimum Fax perché ci sta regalando a sua volta una grande emozione, forse più intellettuale, essendo da alcune settimane prima in classifica nella classifica italiana dei libri venduti, e questo merita secondo me un riconoscimento per una casa editrice indipendente, combattiva, di ricerca e appunto di percorso, che è riuscita in qualche modo a piazzarsi là sopra, dove normalmente c'è anche altra gente. Quindi complimenti a tutti di Minimum Fax e ringrazio John Barth e aspettiamo di sentire cosa ci racconta.
I'm going to read in English what you have before you in Italian, so that you can hear it in my voice instead of the silent voice of print in another language. Mille grazie to Martina Testa and her colleagues at Minimum Fax for translating and publishing the story collection, Life is Another Story, and for inviting my wife and me to Rome to celebrate its publication. Robert Frost once defined poetry as that which gets lost in translation. But I like to think that with prose, it's a different story. It's a different story, so to speak. 40 years ago, when my novel from the 1960s, The Sockweed Factor, published in Inglese, Coltivatori di Marilano, was translated into German as Der Tabakhandler, the German reviews were so positive that I suspected that my book might actually have gained in translation. If something of that sort turns out to be the case with these stories, now, back in the middle of the last century, when I was a 20-year-old university student trying to find my voice as a fledgling storyteller, my chief navigation stars were the high modernists on the one hand, especially James Joyce, Franz Kafka, and William Faulkner, and on the other hand, the great oral tale-telling tradition as exemplified by the Kitab della, The 1001 Nights, and its numerous European spin-offs. The major 18th and 19th century novelists, which everybody reads in their literature courses, were of less importance to me, with a few exceptions: Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, Denis Diderot's Jacques Falis, because they are so rebellious and unorthodox, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, and his great precursor, Cervantes' Don Quixote. In part, this was an accident of my university curriculum and of my financial circumstances. I was enrolled at Johns Hopkins University in one of America's first degree-granting creative writing programs, and because the works of living or recently dead writers were not taught in the university's traditional literature departments, it was in our writing program that I studied Hemingway, Faulkner, Joyce, Mann, Proust, Kafka. At the same time, to help pay my college tuition, I worked as a book filer in the university library, especially in the stacks of Greek and Roman classics, which adjoined the alcoves of medieval and Renaissance literature and Sanskrit and Near Eastern literature. Not surprisingly, I did a lot of browsing among the books that I was reshelving, and thus I discovered not only Petronius' Satyricon of its Metamorphoses, the great Sanskrit tale cycle Tata Sarit Sagara, the Ocean of Story, and Scheherazad's 1001 Nights, but also the European tale cycles that they inspired: Boccaccio's Decameron, Giambattista Basili's Pentameron, or Tale of Tales, Marguerite of Navarre's Heptameron, all these amorins, the satires of Pietro Argentino, and Straparola's Facetious Nights. Of these, my favorite was, and to this day remains, Scheherazad's 1001 Nights, for several reasons. Not only are her stories, and stories within stories, and stories within stories within stories, not only Are they marvelously entertaining? But her entertain me or die situation with the homicidally jealous king is more or less emblematic of every storyteller's situation. No matter how many good stories Scheherazade has told already, she's only as good as her next story. The storyteller's life is always on the line, literally in Scheherazade's case, figuratively for the rest of us, especially as the audience for novels and short stories grows ever smaller in the age of film, television, and the internet. The old Spanish poet Pedro Salinas, who was in exile from Franco, Spain, at my university, Johns Hopkins, when I was a student, in whose class I read Cervantes in my student days. Salinas liked to say that Don Quixote is a book that we should reread every 10 years or so to measure our own journey through life. I haven't done that with Cervantes, although Quixote and Sancho Panza, along with Odysseus, Huckleberry Finn, and Scheherazade, remain my chief narrative icons, my navigation stars. But I do return frequently to the 1001 Nights for re-inspiration, and recently had the pleasure of writing a foreword with the Signet Classics edition of the 1001 Nights in America. Not far behind them among my touchstones is Boccaccio's Decameron, with its wonderful narrative frame, inspired by the 1001 Nights, but impressively different. Instead of a homicidally jealous emperor who deflowers who marries a virgin every night and then has her executed the next morning, lest she cuckold him as his late wife did, we have in Boccaccio 10 ladies and gentlemen escaping the great Florentine plague of 1348 by entertaining one another with stories for 10 nights in their comfortable rural retreat. 100 tales in all, instead of Scheherazade's 267. Hers often require several nights to tell in order to keep her murderous auditor interested. And in Boccaccio, they're told by 10 interestingly different tellers instead of just one, not on pain of death if they fail to entertain, but merely to amuse themselves while the city of Firenze dies. Other arresting differences: Scheherazade's choice of story topics is apparently random, but she does strategically include several stories about people whose lives are spared because they tell a good story. The Decameronians assign themselves a particular topic for each of their 10 nights, a sort of narrative competition, to which Boccaccio adds the wonderful wild card of Dioneo, who's allowed to spin out his nightly tale on any subject at all. And while Scheherazade saves both the king and herself by not only curing him of his kingdom-wrecking Virgin of the Night policy, but also by conceiving and delivering 3 sons by him, and it takes about 1001 nights to do that, and then marrying their father at the story's end, nothing serious develops from the mild flirtations among Boccaccio's 7 ladies and 3 gentlemen and their frequently naughty storytelling. When the plague passes, they return to the Florentine church where they first happened to meet. They politely bid one another arrivederci and go their separate ways. End of story. And bravo, Giovanni Boccaccio. These were among the models that I had in mind for my own book called The Book of 10 Nights and a Night, published a few years ago. But the figure of Scheherazade occurs in several of my earlier books as well. Indeed, she and Boccaccio and Basile and Ovid inspired me some decades ago to write an essay surveying the whole corpus, the whole body of frame tale literature, tales within tales, from many different cultures over several millennia, of which one of the finest modern practitioners was another Italian, Italo Calvino, whom it was my great privilege to invite to Johns Hopkins in the early 1970s for what I believe to have been his first literary visit to the United States. Calvino and I shared a great admiration for the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. Idolo's wife, as I recall, was from Argentina, Esther Calvino. And when I told him that my first short story collection, Lost in the Funhouse, published here as La Casa de la Alegría, was my attempt to assimilate Borges' wonderful ficciones, I was delighted when Calvino replied that his cosmic comics and other tale cycles were likewise inspired by Borges. So, Petronius, Virgil, Ovid, Aretino, Boccaccio, Basile, and Calvino, not to mention Dante, Moravia, Morante, Svevo, Pizzardi, Gada, and Eco. I have enjoyed, admired, and sometimes even learned from them, as if from a series of helpful Italian zios, or zia in the case of Signora Morante. Mille grazie, Italia.